transparent process. And this is for the Opioid Abatement Council when processing these requests. And this also applies to the carryover request as well, or process as well. All of these grant contract amendments and project modification requests, they must go to the must be submitted to the Opioid Abatement Executive Director or designee, and this would need to be in writing. And from that point, this information will be shared with the OAC for discussion and a vote. It's important to note that the way these internal guidelines are written is that if this process isn't followed, then grantees, this could potentially result in a breach of contract, including disallowance of costs, termination of the grant award, or other enforcement within the action within the Opioid Abatement Council's authority. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at these, the grant contract amendment and grant project modification request process, these are broken out into two distinct areas. So pre-implementation grant modification request is what we are calling any approval or any request to change a grant project, but that has to occur prior to the contract's execution and also prior to the grant contract being fully implemented. So a good example of pre-implementation grant modification request would be what we are going to be looking at later with University of Memphis Research Foundation. It was a Cycle 2 award, and the grant contract has not been executed, nor has the grant project been implemented. The next type of modification request, we're actually going to be calling this the grant contract amendment. And that's because these pertain to changes that are submitted after the community grant contract has been fully executed, and also after the grant project has been implemented. And to be implemented, we are defining that as evidenced by the submission and payment of at least one grant-related invoice. Next slide, please. Okay. And if you've had a chance to look at the guidelines, you'll know that there's several key terms that we did include in the guidelines. There are 4 that I've added to this slide because I want to kind of highlight some of the significance of those key terms. One is a material change. And so I talked about this a little bit at the March 5th meeting. And so we're defining a material change as any change that result in a significant shift from the grant project's scope within the grant project scope. One thing that's important, that it doesn't matter how significant the change is to the grant project scope, it is our expectation that those changes will not deviate from the core mission or the original intent of the grant project. And that's very important. For a non-material change, these are minor administrative or operational adjustments to the community grant project. Again, these do not affect the project's core mission or original intent. And so I want to talk a little bit more about non-material change, and that's on the next slide.
Ron has his hand raised.
Oh, okay, sure.
Oh, I just wondered, Sean, now if it's a good time to ask about the non-material change, but you may cover it next. My question, just to get it out there, was generally when you say large amounts of funding, I'm used to grants having like 5% or 10% or something. That just defining that was my only question. But otherwise, I commend you guys. These are really awesome.
Thank you, and that's a good question. And we do define in terms of changes, and where we have a percentage applied to that, it's only pertaining to those the budget. So if it's like I think the threshold we have is between 10 to 25%, and I actually want to get the council to weigh in on that as well. Thank you, Ron. Next slide. All right, good. Thank you, Mary. So this slide here talks about the pre-implementation grant modification requests. Again, these are the type of modification requests that are making changes prior to the implementation of the grant project or the execution of the grant contract. I have a few things highlighted here because I want to get the council's guidance here. Again, in the March 5th meeting, I kind of talked about what the existing process is now for grant modification requests is that if with the executive director and in consultation with legal counsel, if the determination has made that the change is actually a material change, then those changes go to the council for a discussion and a vote to approve. If it's been determined to be a non-material change, those, whether or not to approve or deny, it happens at the OAC office level. And so I want to kind of bring that up again and to see if the council has any concerns with that approach, because if you do not, then what I'd like to do is go back and make some minor changes to these guidelines to make this process only in scope for those material changes.
All right, thank you, Sean. Does anybody have any comments or feelings around that? Dr. Cowan, you have a ton of experience in this. What are your thoughts around this?
No, I think they're very good. I mean, of course, when we try to implement them, we will see, what refinements will be needed.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think I'm assuming also that Sean and Mary will, when we have the council meeting, as you know, almost everybody, almost everybody, but many times you need to modify a grant. And so just the question of, will they kind of come with a recommendation to kind of speed us along? But yeah, I think they can find them.
And the other person I would like to call out to hear from, if it's okay, Lisa, you work in this field on a daily basis. You've got a ton of experience. Are you in agreement? Is there anything you want to bring up?
I mean, there's not anything I want to bring up. So it looks like it's very well thought out. We'll just see how the process goes.
That's always the devil, right? There'll be something come up that we didn't think of, but I want to make sure that, I know you two have a ton of experience in these, and we'll make sure I hear from you. So I appreciate it. Anybody else? All right, Sean, unless somebody was unnecessarily muted, we can proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. So again, just to elaborate a little more on the pre-implementation grant modification requests, the way that the internal guidelines are written is that the council may consider a pre-implementation grant modification request and as far as like how the modification request impacts the start date of the community grant project as originally approved. Also, you would want to, consider whether or not those changes impact how the grantee is going to be held accountable or maintain their accountability over the grant project. And then finally, you would consider whether or not the grant modification changes are going to continue to be aligned with the community grant's original terms. And that's something that you'll see throughout here. I think it's important that, that we can extend some flexibility to grant agencies to modify their grant, but also wanting to make sure that it doesn't have an impact on the original mission or intent of the grant project as it was awarded. Okay,
right, thanks,
next
Sean.
slide, please. Thank you, Mary. The next two slides discusses the community grant contract amendment. And again, this is the change that a proposed change that occurs after the grant contract has been executed and the grant project has been implemented. And so this slide just gives some examples of when a grant contract amendment may be considered. Again, and based on, what the council has just, given us permission to do, this would only apply to when the executive director in consultation with the legal counsel has determined these changes to be material changes. And that would be changes, pertaining to the budget adjustments, changes in the grant project scope or activities, unforeseen circumstances, compliance and regulatory requirements, and programmatic improvements. And this list comes from some examples of how some of the changes that we already get in terms of modifications. And so that's kind of where this list is coming from some that have already, that most likely to happen based on past experience, basically. Next slide, please. This slide kind of outlines some of those grant contract amendment changes that may not be considered. Again, talking about anything that could potentially alter the community grant project's core mission or original intent. Also significant reduction in the number of individuals served by the program, grant project or program outcomes. We would also, something that you may not want to consider would be if the changes replace core grant program services with unrelated activities. And then, and just kind of go through here quickly. Another important one would be if the changes included unallowable costs. We've talked about that in a previous meeting. And then finally, if the change occurred prior to the implementation of the community grant project, or if it was executed prior to the community grant contract being executed. Next slide, please. All right, there's a lot of information here, and I'm just going to kind of just keep it high level. But this slide outlines some of the submission requirements that a grantee would have to, the process they would follow to submit a request to amend their grant contract or modify their grant project. Again, I wanted to keep the process kind of general to give the OAC office some flexibility in terms of how we would want that process to look. And so as you can see, the submission would be must be submitted to the OAC office in a manner and format prescribed by the OAC office, and this would be no later than 30 calendar days before the proposed changed, and it would be signed by the grantee's agency executive director or designated authority. Also, I will tell you this, that we've had some internal discussions about this, and I think that what would probably be easier for us, but also easier for grant agencies would be if we were able to develop a form that could be submitted through FormStack. And that would help us in the office be able to better track this information, but I think it would also streamline the process for grant agencies as well. But again, I think that as we get into this and start working through the process, we may have to tweak it, to fine tune it as we move along. Okay, next slide, please.
I lost which slide we're on, Sean. I am so sorry.
Hey, Sean, it's Tyler.
Yes.
Just a quick question. I'm just wondering a little bit about that 30 days. I know we want to balance that unforeseen circumstances are obviously unforeseen, but I worry a little bit about 30 days and being able to get a decision back to the grantee in time to make a change, or if the council declines their amendments, for them to be able to pivot. So I'm wondering if it's something no later than 30 days, but we want to have maybe some language in there, something along the lines of within, I don't know, 7 or 14 days of knowledge of a need for some sort of amendment. I don't know. We have enough attorneys and judges on the call that they can probably come up with much better wordsmithing than I can. But I think what we don't want is we don't want an agency to wait until 31 days before submit something to us, and then there be a halt in their ability to provide services because we're working through our process of being able to call an emergency meeting and deliberate getting this whole group together. So just a recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Tyler. Any
And
other
one other-
thoughts on that?
Yeah, just I agree with Tyler. Certainly in university systems, if you realize the need for a change, it can take quite a while to get it through the various regulatory reviews. So it can really add, at least a couple of weeks or more. So yeah, I think maybe slightly modifying this in a way that, we'll have plenty of time to maybe get it approved. I'm assuming some of the changes wouldn't have to be implemented until, on a certain date, but others might to avoid delaying the project.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So this slide here talks about what the review and approval authority would be. And so again, we've talked about this for those material changes. These grant contract amendments and grant project modifications would be shared with the council to make a decision and to approve or deny. And the non-material changes would be reviewed and approved or denied at the OSC office level. And so again, this is how the process currently looks like. And so I appreciate you guys allowing us to continue this process. Next step, or next slide. The next few slides are just, kind of outlines the process, after, we've rendered a decision. So according to the internal guidelines, all grant agencies are going to be notified in writing of the decision, whether that decision was to approve or deny the grant contract amendment or modification. Implementation of the approved grant contract amendment or modification, we would expect that for those pre-implementation grant modifications, the modification would not be considered effective until formal written approval is issued. For the community grant contract amendments, it would not be considered effective until, one, formal written approval was issued, but also the contract amendment would have to be fully executed and approved by all appropriate parties. And then finally, grantees must operate under the original community grant contract terms until approval is finalized. Next slide. The OAC office is going to be responsible for the record keeping and documentation or managing the documents for these modification requests and grant contract amendments. That's something that we do now. We also provide technical assistance, and this is something we provide grant agencies, before they formally submit a request to modify their grant contract. We would continue to do that. And sometimes, grant agencies will reach out to us to get feedback in terms of how they should better prepare the modification request to make sure that, they are meeting, our expectations and requirements. And so we would continue to provide that technical assistance. As far as monitoring the community grant contract amendments and modifications, we would continue to expect that the approved grant project modifications would remain subject to all community grant requirements, including the financial and program reporting, fiscal and program monitoring compliance reviews, and also our requirements around allowable costs. Next slide. This slide here, and I think Ryan, you may have been the one to mention this. So this is the decision matrix for again, internal purposes. And so this is what I envision this looking like. And please, let me know if we need to take another approach. But I think what would help the council is that when we submit these grant contract amendments and modification requests for the material changes to you to review for a decision, I think it would be helpful if this was in a spreadsheet and with some important information to kind of help, but also our recommendation in terms of, what, based on our review, what we would do. And I think, and it would be helpful, if this is what we would use to make that recommendation. And I think it would just be basically based on our review, if we deem the request low risk or moderate risk or high risk. And I'm hoping that that would be helpful to the council in making a final decision in terms of whether you wanted to approve or deny the request. And if there's any other information that we would need to put in the spreadsheet, we can certainly do that. And that may be a trial and error. We may have submit something and then just tweak it as we move forward. Okay, so at this time, will the OAC consider a motion to approve the grant contract amendment and modification requests?
Thanks, Sean. And I think, other than the input we've had, I think we're in a place we can do this. So do I have a motion to approve this process?
So moved.
Make motion.
I got a motion by Dr. Barrett, and we'll have a second by somebody. I'm sorry you didn't jump up on my screen. So
Tommy.
I didn't catch it. Who was it? Tommy?
Tommy.
All right. Okay. So we got a motion by Dr. Barrett, a second by Tommy. Any discussion or questions? All right, hearing none. Mary, would you proceed with a roll call vote since we are virtual?
Yes, Armando Fontes,
Yes.
Brian Buck,
Yes.
Clay Jackson,
Yes.
Ken Moore, I believe he's still not here, Lisa Tipton,
Yes.
Mike Flynn,
Yes.
Ron Cowan,
Yes.
Tim Fournette,
Yes.
Tommy Farmer,
Yes.
Tyler Barrett,
Yes.
Shane Sexton, not here, Stephanie Vanderpool,
Yes.
Steve Lloyd,
Yes.
Wayne Wyckoff.
Yes.
All right. The motion carries. Thank you. All right, Sean, I think you still are the man.
Yep, thank you. All right, moving on to our internal guidelines for carryover requests. Again, this first slide here just kind of is an overview of the purpose. And just like with the previous guidelines, the purpose of the community grant carryover guidelines is to ensure community grant funds are expended within the approved grant period. And it's also to, ensure that there is, that we have some transparency in terms of our process, but also a process that's consistent across all, grant agencies' requests for carryovers. I think that, these guidelines in particular, which we see more of than, with the grant modification and contract amendments, I think this is going to be, most beneficial to grant agencies. And we already have several that have, have expressed an interest in submitting carryover requests. And so, but we've told them that they're pending approval of these guidelines. So I do think that this is going to be, have a positive impact on our grant agencies. This slide here is the eligibility requirements for a carryover consideration. Again, what's important is that, all carryover requests must be submitted in writing to the Opioid Abatement Council Executive Director or designee. And just like with the grant contract amendments and modification requests, we also we envision that submission process is going to be where they would submit a form that we've created through via FormStack. Also, here is just a list of some of the criteria that we are suggesting that the council can consider when looking at carryover requests. One being the carryover request supports the continuation or completion of an approved community grant project activity. Also, and this is very important, is that the grantee is in good standing, including compliance with reporting, invoicing, and contractual requirements. And then also, and I think this is something that Clay Jackson had asked about or had, recommended, is that the grantee must have a fiscal or program monitoring review. I also tweaked this a little bit to add fiscal risk assessment as well. And that's because most of our grant agencies get a fiscal risk assessment up front. And that's all grant agencies except state grantees or county grantees. They don't get a fiscal risk assessment just because I understand that, it would, just because they are state or county, it would be a low assessment, risk assessment score. So in that case, if this was ever a state grantee or a county government grantee who was requesting a carryover request, we would make sure that they had at least a fiscal or program monitoring review because they wouldn't get a fiscal risk assessment. Also, we would want to, things to consider. The grantees community grant funds have not been previously restricted or disallowed. We'd also want to consider the amount of the carryover request, the programmatic justification, community grant project progress, and then finally, we'd want to look at the history of their carryover requests. This the last sentence here is what I think, Ron, is what I was talking about, where this, and I've got this highlighted because I want the council to kind of weigh in and to finalize this. But what we are proposing here is that the Opioid Abatement Council may consider whether the unexpended amount falls between 10% and 25% of the fiscal year budget from which the funds are being carried over. And, after talking to our fiscal director, and she suggested that we may want to change this, and as opposed to saying 10%, between the 10 and 25%, perhaps just making that less than 25%.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I like that change. I don't know if everybody else does,
Okay.
but I like that.
That's very typical, I think.
I
with
agree.
Yeah.
Good.
Simple.
All right,
But
thank
to
you.
go back to, well, yeah, what if it's 9, right? Just go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa.
Clay Jackson has his hand raised.
Okay.
Sean, help me understand here. I'm just end of the day stupid, I think, but the council may consider whether the unexpended amount is less than. I mean, that's just math. You'll tell us if it's less than 25. What are we considering? Whether we're going to vote on it or
And yes, that's a really good question. And so what that means, and I have in the decision matrix, it'll make even more sense. But how we would define whether or not the request was low, moderate, or high risk would be based on how much of the carryover, the percentage of the carryover when compared to their fiscal year budget.
Hey, Sean, if I just did a little wordsmithing on this, did I change the intent, or is that getting at what you're saying? The Opioid Abatement Council may consider the request if the unexpended amount is less than 25%. Is that correct?
That makes much more sense. Thank you.
Making sure I
Okay.
didn't change the
And Clay,
intent.
does that make sense now that she revised
I got it now. Thank you.
Perfect.
But does
Thank
that
you.
mean we won't consider any that are over 25%? Because that's how I read it.
And that doesn't mean that they will not submit, anything that would be above that, but that would put them in a high risk, give them a high risk score when we're making the decision. And I'll just need to make sure that I believe the decision matrix already has that built in, but we'll see when we get there. But
Yeah,
Ron, are you okay with that, with being
I'm
less than
concerned
25%?
about it. I'm concerned about it, Sean, because if we say we may consider if it's less than 25, that seems to me that if it's 25.1, we cannot consider it. And there might be circumstances where we want to consider it.
Yeah, that was my concern. It's just slightly changed in terms of the wording.
Let me ask you this, does the fact that we have may in there helps? Because I think that was one of the reasons why we said may, because it doesn't obligate you to it, but it's just may, as opposed to shall consider. But we'll change this anyway, because that was really the intent, not to lock you into whether, to only consider it if it's 25% or less, but just to use that as may.
Tyler
Hey,
has his
Sean.
hand raised. Go
Sean,
ahead.
I'm just wondering, I see that you've got a grid down there, like slide 26, that I assume is going to be similar to the one that you had for the last.
That's
Should
right.
Should this just be one of the variables here? as far as, what percent of unspent money, and if it's, and we can kind of think through that, if it's, they have 75% remaining because they weren't able to accomplish their program, that might be something that's higher risk than if they've got, 9% because
That's right.
they just have some.
Are you-
So I'm wondering, I agree with Clanth and the others. I don't know that we want to have this specifically called out as far as just this element is going to potentially tie our hands one way or the other, versus this is just one of the factors that would be considered amongst these other ones
Okay.
when we're determining whether it should be carried over.
So we could just basically remove the percentages and then just keep that in the decision matrix. Is that what you're
Yeah, keep it in
proposing?
decision makers, Sean, because
Okay.
I realize what you're saying with may, but by saying you may do it if it's less than, you imply
Gotcha.
you cannot do it if it's more than.
Absolutely.
That's implied.
Okay. Thank you. It's very helpful. And so we're going to remove that.
Remove this.
That last sentence. Yes.
Okay. Ready?
Yep. And I'll make sure that we remove it from the guidelines.
Okay, great.
Okay. Next slide. This slide just, outlines the submission requirements for a carryover request. Again, the form is, we'll develop the form where it can be submitted, via form stack. But some of the things that, we would want to capture would be one, the programmatic justification for the use of the unexpended grant funds, the requested carryover amount, the revised budget, and the budget justification for the carryover funds. We also want to be able to capture the timeline for the expenditure of the carryover funds and the confirmation that the proposed use of funds remains consistent with the approved community grant project activities and scope. We also want to look at the impact of the progress of the outcomes of the community grant project if the carryover request is not approved. I just thought that would be something for you all to take into consideration if you are thinking about what the potential impact of that could be on the grant project. Also, finally, the grantee shall submit carryover requests to the OAC office electronically and in a manner and format prescribed by the OAC office. Any thoughts on that? Okay. Next slide, please. Again, the submission deadline, and this is another 30-day calendar day, so I'd love to get your feedback on that. But we're saying that the carryover request must be submitted to the OAC office within 30 calendar days after the end of the community grants fiscal year to which the carryover request applies. And so the reason why, and I don't know if 30 days is going to work, but the reason we were looking at within a specified period of time after the end of that fiscal year is because it's based on our experience with the cycle 1 carryovers, a lot of those carryover requests did not come in until around the end of that fiscal year. And that's when a lot of grantees didn't really know how much they were going to have to carry over. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
No hands are raised.
Okay, good. Again, late submissions may not be considered. The approval authority would be, again, the Opioid Abatement Council, but all carryover requests shall be approved by the Opioid Abatement Council. Again, just to clarify, there's no, material or non-material changes here. All carryover requests will go to the council for approval. And then again, I'll reference the matrix here in terms of what that decision process would look like. Next slide, please. This slide just talks about the denial of the carryover requests. It basically, it's within the council's sole discretion to deny, any carryover requests. The Opioid Abatement Council, when determining whether to deny a carryover request, may consider the following criteria: the pattern of the delayed invoice submissions, failure to initiate approved community grant project activities, poor community grant performance based on the grantee's current fiscal risk assessment and or the fiscal or program monitoring review. And then finally, if there were attempts to materially change the approved community grant project without authorization, that could be something that you would want, may want to consider. Next slide. As far as monitoring the carryover funds, this would be something that would be the responsibility of the OAC office. Again, we would do that through the program reporting, fiscal and program monitoring and compliance reviews. And also we would want to make sure that these carryover requests adhere to any allowable cost requirements. Failure to use carryover funds. The approved carryover funds must be expended within the designated carryover period unless otherwise specified or authorized. The Opioid Abatement Council shall monitor, Opioid Abatement Council office shall monitor any carryover funds not expended within the approved carryover period and shall follow appropriate protocols to ensure unspent funds are returned to the Opioid Abatement Trust Fund unless additional authorization is granted by the Opioid Abatement Council. Okay, thank you, Mary. Again, this is the matrix, the decision matrix, and just like with the modification and grant contract amendment process, we would share this information with you in a spreadsheet with our recommendation using this decision matrix. Okay, thank you, Mary. So at this time, will the council approve a motion to approve the internal guidelines for processing community grant fund carryover requests?
All right. Thanks, Sean. Does anybody have anything before we get to entertaining a motion? All right,
Just want to say thanks. It's Stephanie. Just want to say thanks to the office for doing such a thorough job on thinking this through. So I'll move it forward.
And all
thanks.
the thanks goes to Sean and Sam as his editor. So this was yes. Sean's brainchild. So thank you, Sean.
Steve, I'll second.
All right. I got a motion on the floor from Dr. Vanterpool, second from Dr. Barrett. Any discussion? Hearing none, Mary, would you proceed with a roll call vote?
Armando Fontes.
Yes.
Ron Buck.
Good work, Sean. Yes.
Thank you.
Clay Jackson.
Yes.
Ken Moore. Lisa Tipton.
Yes.
Mike Flynn. Mike. You're on mute.
Yes.
Okay, great. Ron Cowan.
Yes.
Tim Fournette.
Yes.
Tommy Farmer.
Yes.
Tyler Barrett.
Yes.
Stephanie Vanterpool.
Yes.
Steve Lloyd.
Yes.
And Wayne Wyckoff.
For Mike. Yes.
All right, thank you. The motion carries. I do want to say this, and I know we're going to get to this next one, but you're talking about Sean there. We know one of the things about being the chair of this council, which I've loved doing, is anytime that I go into anything in front of the legislature, any kind of updates, the state comptroller is going to audit us, which is not a good feeling. I always feel incredibly comfortable going in there because I know the work that Sean and Mary do. So, man, thanks, Sean. I love it, and you can proceed. You bet, man.
Thank you, my friend. Before I go into the our last agenda item here, I want to just clarify too, again, the guidelines that we just approved, they are for the internal use of the Opioid Abatement Council and office. But based on these internal guidelines, we will be, preparing some educational material for all grantees. So they have that information as well. And so I just wanted to kind of say that. So moving on. Thank you, Mary. So our last item here is just a review of the University of Memphis Research Foundation's community grant. This is their Cycle 2 community grant modification request. And just to summarize, in the March 5th meeting, I had presented their grant modification request, where at that time they had a $1.8 million grant for 3 years. And because they were getting some HRSA funding to cover the same education and training that was going to be a part of their OEC grant project, they had requested to modify their Cycle 2 grant project, where they had originally proposed or was awarded to provide, training to 6 PhD students over a 3-year period, or 6 students per year, 18 for 3 years. And they had recommended or was proposing to modify that and reduce it to 2 students each year. And because the HRSA grant funds were going to be covering some of those students. And so to replace the 4 students that they were not going to be covering or training under our grant, they had recommended or were proposed to extend their training to bachelor level and master's level students. And so the council reviewed that and had requested that I take this back to go back to University of Memphis Research Foundation and ask them to modify their grant modification again to make it more aligned with the original request, and just keep their revised grant project to 2 students, and that's it. And so they did do that. What you're looking at now is just a crosswalk between the original grant proposal and what they have come back with, a revision based on the council's feedback. And so again, some of the things that has not changed, they are still, their Cycle 2 grant project will still be a 3-year grant project, but it has been significantly reduced because they're only going to be focusing on those 2 students per year now. And so that, reduces their total grant budget from a $1.8 million grant to $656,652,000. Again, the total number of people estimated that they're going to impact reduces from 3,000 individuals to 1,000 individuals. Also wanted to kind of point out is that in the original grant proposal, they had 2 partners that they were going to be working with, where these students would actually go and do part of their intern. It was Christ Community Health and Memphis Shelby County Schools. And so with their revised grant project, they've added I think it's like 2 more partners, Our Care and Youth Villages. And that's just because, these have been added because these partners are also going to be serving those students that are being funded under the HRSA grant, but they'll also be serving, or could potentially be serving, the students that are going to be funded under the OAC grant as well. And then they've trimmed some other expenses that was important to do that, to be able to get those that total grant fund more appropriate and aligned with the reduction in the students that they were going to be training. So I'll pause there for any questions. And if there aren't any questions, I'll just be asking the council to consider a motion to approve University of Memphis Research Foundation's revised community grant project for Cycle 2.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Does anybody have any questions for Sean around this?
Mr. Chairman,
All
I
right, is there
move to
anybody-
approve.
Okay, I've got a move to approve from Dr. Jackson.
Second.
All right, a second. I think that's Dr. Barrett. Any discussion? Anybody need to recuse themselves? All right, hearing none. If you proceed to a roll call vote, Mary.
Armando Fontes,
Yes.
Ron Buck,
Yes.
Clay Jackson,
Yes.
Lisa Tipton,
Yes.
Mike Flynn,
Yes.
Ron Cowan,
Yes.
Tim Cornell,
Yes.
Tommy Farmer,
Yes.
Tyler Barrett,
Yes.
Stephanie Vanterpool,
Yes.
Steve Lloyd,
Yes.
Wayne Wyckoff.
Yes.
All right, so the motion carries. Thank you again, Sean.
Great, thank
Mary,
you.
does that
That's
bring us
all
to the end of our agenda?
Yeah, all of our agenda items, and now we're at public comment.
All right, do we have anybody for public comment?
All right, I'm asking my office if they see any hands raised. I'm not able to see the attendees. Nathan, can you let us know if there are any hands raised?
Yes, I can. So far, no hands raised.
Okay. Well, I
Motion to
think we've given
adjourn.
All right, I love it. Thank you, Mr. Wyckoff. You're a good man. Motion to adjourn by Mr. Wyckoff. Do I have a second? I'll second it.
Second.
Any discussion? All right. Hearing none, Mary will proceed with the roll call vote.
Armando Fontes,
Yes.
Ron Buck,
Yes.
Clay Jackson,
Yes.
Lisa Tipton,
Yes.
Mike Flynn,
Yes.
Ron Cowan,
Yes.
Tim Fournette,
Yes.
Tommy Farmer,
Yes.
Tyler Barrett,
Yes.
Stephanie Vanderpool,
Yes.
Steve Lloyd,
Yes.
and Wayne Wyckoff.
Yes.
All right, the motion carries. This emergency meeting of the OAC for April 14, 2026 is adjourned. Thank you guys for your time and have a great Tuesday night.
All right, bye.